There we go. Now I've got audio. False alarm. I had myself muted. Um, how's it going, everybody? It's been a long time since we've done a live stream. We got a bunch of people watching right now, and I'm here with the awesome Amber O'Hearn. She has been on a carnivorous ketogenic diet for longer than most people have even known what the heck a carnivorous ketogenic diet is. She's probably one of the original pioneers of carnivorous style eating. And I'm honored that she took the time out of her day to come and hang out with us. And yeah, so how's it going, Amber?
It's great, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, we really appreciate you coming on. So, 9 years ago, this all supposedly, allegedly started. How how did you get into eating an all meat diet 9 years ago? That must have been what, 2009?
Yep, it was a total accident, really. I never would have believed that I would be here now because I was on a ketogenic diet. I'd been on a ketogenic diet for 12 years already at that point, and I was really into the science of that and a great advocate of it. But over the time that I had been on that ketogenic diet, I'd gone through pregnancies and I'd aged and I had started to gain weight. In fact, I'd gained so much weight that I was nearly 200 pounds, and my low carb diet was keeping me from gaining. Well, I was gaining, so it was slowing my gain, which I knew because anytime I said, well, screw this, this isn't even working, I would immediately start to gain like a monster. Um, but it wasn't getting me where I wanted to be, and nothing that I was reading in the science could give me any pointers as to why that would be. And I was just so frustrated. I heard about some people online who were doing what they called zero carb. Um, for historical reasons, we still call it that sometimes, but I try to avoid that term because it's really not about the carbs. It's about plants versus animal food. But anyway, I thought, well, they're a lot like me. They were having trouble on their ketogenic diet getting to the weight that they wanted, but when they cut out the plants, they lost the weight. And that's all it was about for me was weight and vanity. And so I thought, well, I can try that. I'll just do it for a short period of time and then I can go back to my maintenance diet and anytime things start to get out of control, I could go back to that if it works for me. I didn't know if it was going to work, but I set aside 3 weeks. Frankly, it sounded really intimidating. I loved vegetables, and the idea of having nothing else on my plate, not even a salad, was not, it just felt weird. But I got myself psyched up, and I did it for 3 weeks. And not only did the weight start dropping off suddenly again, but my mood improved. And this was something I had no idea was going to be connected to diet. Uh oh, I can't hear you, Tristan.
How about
There you
now?
are.
There we go.
Yes.
There we go. Technical difficulties as always. So, what were the mood improvements that you noticed? I mean, you. It sounds like it was pretty staggering.
It was because all along, I've told this story, I've set it up as a weight story, and it really was um, for me experientially. But at the same time as all my weight problems happened, starting back at the beginning of university, I also had concurrent mood problems. It started with a major depressive episode that I had when I was 20, getting diagnosed with depressive disorder. And then that was then called treatment resistant depressive disorder because nothing I did for it, namely a lot of drugs, really helped in any long term sense at all. And so it's just managing this constant either low level or going into deeper depression for all that time. And then so it was in my 30s that I got re-diagnosed with type 2 bipolar disorder because I started having a few episodes of what they call hypomania, which is not, it differs from mania in that it never gets to a psychotic episode. Thank God, because I know that it can be really horrifying and difficult for everyone. But it's not like it was easy. It was no walk in the park, and I was constantly struggling, trying different meds, all of which came with different side effects and none of which helped. And so I was on a very low dose of the medication that I was trying at that point wasn't really helping that much, but maybe a little bit. You know how you try something and you think that might be helping, but I can't really tell? Those are, I don't know.
Say like an almost placebo effect. Couldn't really tell if it was doing anything, but just
Yeah.
something didn't feel right. Now, did you remember you mentioned you were doing like a standard ketogenic diet before you started messing with zero carb? Did that seem to help at all with the depression and those symptoms?
It did help somewhat, and I think more than that drug, enough that I could tell and wasn't doubting it. But it never really got me all the way. It didn't stop the bipolar from progressing. And what I mean by progressing is that the symptoms started changing. My moods would, instead of just having the exuberant happy side and the depressed side, I would have what are called mixed states. So I was starting to see anxiety, and I'm a really laid back person. I can remember as a teenager living in Montreal, had a monk on the street. I stopped and talked to him. He said, "Wow, you're one of the most laid back people I've ever met." So like, I was really chill. Never had anxiety before. All these new symptoms coming up, and the pace of it, the cycling was becoming what they call rapid cycling. It was really a nightmare. And so not only, well, you asked me if a ketogenic diet helped that. I could tell that the more strict I was about the levels of carbs, the better my mood was in general, but it didn't stop it from getting worse and from having that down and the high that was really characteristic of it. And it wasn't until,
And back then you were looking at it as carbs rather than as like plant versus animal foods. It was just like
yeah,
lower carb, I might get better symptoms. I might feel a little bit better, is what you thought.
yes. And at that point in my life, everything I knew about diet that didn't come from my previous life with a vegetarian diet, it was all framed in terms of carbohydrates. So even when I first heard about paleo, which was after I heard about ketogenic diets, I thought, well, of course, if you remove the grains and the legumes, you're going to be lower. I attributed it all to that. I didn't have any real belief, or I didn't feel like there was reason to believe that the type of food could matter until I had this experience personally. So it was then, yeah, and it took Tristan, it took like 2 weeks. And I said to my husband at the time, I said, you know, my mood's been really good. I talked about it to him because when you're bipolar, you start to distrust your own brain. You're taught to, in fact, because it's a characteristic of the disease to not recognize that you're having mood problems and to attribute things like you say, oh, my life's getting worse, but it's actually that you can't handle it. And so you learn this whole distrust in your own brain, which is one of the shittiest positions I've ever been in, because what else can you trust but your own brain and perceptions, right? So I said to him, I feel like I've been so much better. And he just, stopped everything and looked at me very sincerely and said, your mood has been more stable than I've ever seen it in the 10 plus years that I've known you. So I knew it wasn't my imagination, but I didn't know if that was going to last or if it was a coincidence or what it was. And it wasn't until many months had gone past that I started to say, yeah, I have to attribute this to the diet because this is different from anything else that I've ever experienced.
And where did you actually first hear about zero carb? I mean, like 9 years ago, right now there's this huge, I mean, this has probably been like 3 years of this keto craze, right? And then now there's a lot of attention being given to carnivorous style diets. You had like, I don't know, Joe Rogan had Sean Baker on, and I think that kind of kicked off quite a bit of fury online about it. And then Michaela Peterson was on his show as well. So it's getting this kind of like mainstream attention. I mean, mainstream as far as internet goes, at least. And you're even seeing mainstream media outlets talking about these diets now. But 9 years ago, what? How the hell did you hear about this madness? Like, who the heck was doing this 9 years ago?
Yeah, it was definitely fringe of the fringe. I mean, there was no, Facebook might have existed, but there certainly weren't groups about it on there. And all the main groups that I interacted with for information about low carb were forums that were completely outside. And I don't actually know what search led me to the link of this forum, but there was a forum. It was relatively new. It was called Zeroing In on Health, and it was led by Charles Washington and Dana Spencer, who were administrators on it. And it was all about this eating no plants and meat only. And they were influenced by Owsley Stanley, the bear, and by Stephenson, the explorer. And we all just we tried it, we talked about it, and compared experiences. It was pretty small.
I'm so
That
sorry.
group.
Just so you know, Amber, the barking that's going on, the audience can't hear it, but you can hear it, and I'm so sorry. I'm gonna keep going. I can
Okay.
hear you, but I'm gonna kick this dog out of the house because being annoying as shit right now. Sorry.
Okay. Sure. Um, so it was a really small forum at the time, maybe dozens of people who were participating. There might have been a lot more. There's always many more lurking as the tip of the iceberg are the active people. But as far as popularity goes, like you said, even low carb, and I don't know if we used the word keto really back then. Maybe we did. But even low carb was still pretty underground, and certainly carnivory was, most people who were low carbers even a year ago have would say low carb is great, but you have to eat your vegetables. And so it was,
Yeah, that's kind of how I felt until, I was almost forced by circumstance to admit that I didn't need them. I mean, it was crazy because I would always think, oh, if I'm gonna eat meat, I need to balance it with the vegetables, right? Like you need the electrolytes from the vegetables, you need the micronutrients, you need the fiber. That's kind of like really kind of, the orthodox dogma in nutrition is that fiber is good, that vegetables are good, that animal foods are a necessary evil almost, right? It's like, well, you got to get the protein, so you maybe got to eat some animals now and then, just because we haven't figured out how to do it in an enlightened way and have lab grown meat. This is kind of like I don't know, maybe the Silicon Valley outlook on diet. And well, so you mentioned Owsley. He seems like kind of, there's not a lot of people that talk about him as far as like the promotion of zero carb diets go now, but Owsley was the original zero carb diet guy. Did
it
you
was
have?
really important for
Yeah.
us on that forum because he just had that example. Like, here's this person who didn't die because we didn't know what the hell we were doing, really. Stephenson, or I'm not sure how he pronounces that, Stephenson. Um, he was also an example, but the bear really lived it for decades, and he did die fairly young in a car accident, and he did get throat cancer. But you got to think this is a guy who was the sound man for the Grateful Dead, and I imagine he probably had a lot of exposures to things. He survived the cancer, so
Yeah,
that's
he
something too.
attributed his long survival after the cancer diagnosis to his diet. At least as far as I've seen, as far as the information goes concerning Owsley. So yeah, if you guys don't know who Owsley is, he was Owsley Stanley's. I mean, he's kind of a counterculture figure from the '60s and really interesting character. But oh, so the forum. What was the forum called back in the day? Because now everyone's on Facebook, right? You don't see that many forums. There's no like, you don't see. I mean, what do you have? The Paleo Diet forum back in the day. I remember. I forget what it was even called. But what was the forum that you mentioned called again?
It was called Zeroing In on Health, which is really interesting because even though I think most of the people who were attracted to that site and that diet at that time, as was the case until very recently, was almost always about weight loss. The thing that was common that people were finding is that it was just an overall health improvement. Today people like Sean Baker have all these anecdotes where we've collected and we've started to see what those health benefits really could look like. And a lot
Yeah.
of it has to do with autoimmune disease. But at the time, it was just like, you know what? I just realized I haven't used my inhaler for asthma for 2 weeks. What's
Mm.
going on? And so we really didn't know whether these experiences were going to hold for everybody. And it was really exciting.
That's so cool. Um, so you started this out. You said I'm gonna try this zero carb thing. What was like one of the biggest reservations that you had? I mean, 9 years ago, I was. I mean, 9 years ago, I was probably just coming out of eating Burger King and Ben and Jerry's every day, like just getting into trying to be healthy and figure out what the hell's going on with my body and what it needs nutritionally. And what was the biggest hurdle for you as far as starting a carnivorous style diet when you first began?
Well, I'm old, so I was 36 already at this time. Um, the biggest difficulty I think was just psychological. The hurdle of, am I really going to just stare at a steak for meal after meal, day after day and I decided the way I'm going to do this is it's going to be temporary. I'm not going to think of it as a lifestyle change, because if I have to think about never having a vegetable again, there's no way I'll do it. So I just said 3 weeks, and I lined it up with my birthday. I guess I was going to turn 36. Um, I said, okay, the end of the 3 weeks will be on my birthday. I'll see where I get to. I'll have a piece of cake and then regroup. Um, and and so um, I also,
You say I loved vegetables, but then the first thing you ate was cake. It was
well, I didn't end up having that piece of cake, in fact, but um, well, it was just because it was my birthday. But and even at that point, I was already into baking all kinds of low carb goods, so it was probably even a like a rice protein cake or something I was planning. But regardless, it was not going to be meat. But I ended up having a piece of homemade pemmican with a candle in it for my 36th birthday. That's how into it I was over the course. After 3 weeks, I was so, this changed my life, and in a very short time. But I had a diversion, because about 1 or 2 weeks after my birthday, I found out I was pregnant. And I thought, well, that's great. I'll just keep doing this. And this is going to be the healthiest pregnancy I've ever had, probably, because I've always had.
Oh,
Sure.
I
Well,
was
I
muted.
had had.
I'm sorry, Amber. I was muted when I asked that question. What I
Oh,
asked
ask
for the
again.
audience, I mute myself when Amber's talking so I don't get the double feedback. What I asked Amber, sorry guys, was everyone's saying no sound now because there's a delay. I asked Amber what sort of feelings might have come up, or what sort of reservations may have come up when she found out she was pregnant, because it's a very unorthodox diet to be doing as far as like mainstream um, yeah, the neonatal prenatal care goes.
Well, so by that time, I'd been on a ketogenic diet for a long time. And I also am the kind of person that I do a deep dive when I get into something. I get really geeky about it. And so I had already, I was not low carb during my previous two pregnancies. And that's partly because I didn't have a lot of support in that and wasn't sure for the first one. But it's partly because I have a familial condition called hyperemesis gravidarum. And that, what happens with people who have that is they become so ill when they're pregnant that they can't keep down any food for the, it's not just morning sickness, it's the duration of their pregnancy. They often have to be hospitalized and hydrated. Very strong in my family. I always had a milder version of it, and I don't know if that's because I got a genetically lucky spin, or if the low carb history that I had developed had somehow made me more resilient. But anyway, long story short, I hadn't had even a low carb pregnancy before, but I had studied it. I had looked up on the net about ketogenic diets during pregnancy, and at that time, everything that you could find, almost everything, was really, really negative. There were all these there were sites on the net that were medical, and so they were authority based, where they would say, if if you're in ketosis while pregnant, you're going to have a retarded baby. Like there was, it was really, really advocated against. But I looked at all the reasons that they would say that, and I couldn't find anything to it. Like they would link to a study where um, dogs who were in the ketosis of starvation had bad litter outcomes, and you go, well, duh, they're starving. That's not from ketosis.
Right. It's
Or
kind of like
they would
the rabbit studies back in the day where it's like, well, we gave rabbits a bunch of saturated fat, and look what it did to them. It destroyed their health. When rabbits are just supposed to
right,
eat frickin' plants all day. So yeah,
right.
yeah.
So they were all of that caliber, and so I never found anything that was persuasive. And in fact, I was also learning that ketones are actually used in the fetus, in the brain, as a perfectly good substrate. And so I thought, there's nothing there's nothing inherently wrong with this. This is just fear mongering. So I was over that aspect of it. In terms of the nutritional aspect, I had also begun to learn about the nutritional completeness of meat, but it really took me many years to come to a full understanding of that. But there wasn't any particular thing that I thought that I wasn't going to be able to get that I knew that a baby should need.
What about magnesium? Right. So a lot of people that get on a zero carb diet, even coming from a ketogenic diet, and they might think, okay, well, there's certain micronutrients like, well, I said magnesium, but let's get into the kind of the most popular one, vitamin C. Like you're gonna get scurvy. You're gonna get the scurvy, and you're. I guess one of the main symptoms of scurvy is inability to produce collagen. You can't synthesize collagen anymore. So, yeah, I mean, well, what about scurvy? You're not getting vitamin C. What the heck?
That's a great one, in part because scurvy manifests really pretty quickly. So I think I might not have this number right, but somewhere on the order of a month it'll take without input of vitamin C to start showing bruising and gum bleeding and the other signs of scurvy. So you would really know right away if that were happening to you. It took me a long time to figure out what was going on with scurvy, because if you look up in the USDA database, for example, they will list meat as having no vitamin C in it. Um, Not salmon. Salmon is listed with some small amount of vitamin C. So I looked at the actual, they have these big, hundreds of pages long documents on how they come up with measurements and RDAs and such. And I looked into that, and I found this chart that shows where they measured, and they have a little code that, like, what measurement device they used for each of the different vitamins that they were measuring. And I think it's code 7 that they put next to the meat and vitamin C, and you look down and it says assumed 0. Assumed 0. So they're just not expecting it there, so they never even looked. And so then I went looking at older documents where they would measure the vitamin C in ox and lamb and other domesticated animals, and it's not 0. So this all, yeah, yeah. So now there, um, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it would vary, of course, in what animal and what piece, and surely. I haven't seen a lot of documentation of it. I had to look pretty far back, and like they might have just taken one sample. So it's hard to say how much variance there is in that. But what I figured out is that if you wanted to get your 10 milligrams of vitamin C per day, that is enough to ward off scurvy, you would only need a pound or two a day of meat, and that's certainly within what I eat. Now the RDA for vitamin C is like it's nearly 10 times that. So I looked into that aspect of it as well. And it turns out that a lot of that RDA is actually based on the belief that we might need more antioxidants. Um, there's no real science behind the rest of that. And so
So
I don't
how
really
was
take it
this
very
assumed?
seriously.
Why was it assumed that we needed so much vitamin C? Like what led them to believe this?
Good question. There are some studies that show that in people with metabolic syndrome, um, sometimes, but not consistently, large doses of vitamin C can sometimes mitigate those symptoms. So to me, that just shows that there's something about metabolic syndrome that's depleting vitamin C. And it's very easy once you start digging into that to see that glucose itself interferes with the uptake of vitamin C. And I think that's the most plausible reason why why vitamin C itself might be sometimes having a positive impact there.
Yeah, that seems to be one of the most interesting theories to me is the all right, so you're looking at glucose and vitamin C actually competing for the same receptor sites?
Yes, the GLUT, I think it's GLUT one of the GLUT receptors. Um, and metabolic syndrome in some papers has actually been hypothesized to be a kind of internalized scurvy in the endothelium, um, which is a really interesting idea. So you can kind of turn Linus Pauling's idea about vitamin C being a cure for everything on its head and say taking away glucose is a cure for everything, um, in that
Interesting.
by
So
those same
by
mechanisms.
flooding the body with vitamin C, you might be actually clogging up these receptor sites where glucose would be uptake would be soaked up. You're basically mitigating the damage from the glucose rather than just giving yourself this great vitamin C. You're basically mitigating damage from glucose with vitamin C
You
supplements.
know, I hadn't thought about it that way. All I was thinking about was that if you increase the ratio of the vitamin C to glucose, then there's more chance that the vitamin C will go in and you won't get that deficiency. But what you just said makes perfect sense as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, because I mean, you're seeing people using megadose vitamin C for cancer treatment, stuff like that. I don't know what kind of results people are getting, but you hear it claimed among kind of alternative circles. Well, what about the other aspect of? There's been another kind of like apologist angle that I've heard for collagen synthesis and prevention of scurvy, and that's because what scurvy affects, as far as symptoms, like the symptoms of scurvy, are the inability to synthesize collagen. But when you're eating a diet that's based on meat, you're getting ridiculous amounts of precursors to collagen formation through like proline and I forget what it was. If it was proline,
Hydroxyproline.
that's it.
Yeah.
Hydroxyproline and was it a glycine analog as well, or so, there was something else that was a constituent. Are you familiar with this argument?
Yes, and I haven't been able to substantiate it. I think it's a neat idea and there may be something to it, but it's also the case that the step to get from those precursors is to the collagen is the one that requires vitamin C as an enzyme. So it's not clear to me that that totally solves the problem. But I think that we have a lot to learn there, and we don't have a lot of organisms that we can use because to study this because almost all animals synthesize vitamin C themselves. And we only have, so we have primates who don't do it. We have guinea pigs and then certain kinds of bats. And so it's really an interesting, really niche in terms of species specificness kind of problem to have.
All right, so vitamin C, that's one of the like deficiencies that people would say you may get. Now, what about fiber? I mean, what are your thoughts on fiber and the role of fiber in the human diet? I mean, this is a hot topic now. You got a lot of people. It seems like some people are almost offended when you bring up the possibility that perhaps fiber isn't the panacea that we're looking for, and perhaps this whole angle of microbiota diversity might be a little bit short-sighted. What are your thoughts on fiber after all this experimentation over 9 years?
Well, it's funny because fiber is one of those truths through repetition, but the repetition has changed over the years. So the microbiome craze is really, really recent. And when people started on the microbiome rhetoric for fiber, they would say, well, here's another reason why we need fiber. But it really isn't another reason. The fact is that all the previous reasons have turned out to not really be true. Like um, I think one of the reasons that fiber was first, there was first interest in it as perhaps a health food was, I believe it was Dennis Burkitt who was studying, I don't remember what hunter-gatherer society it was that had much better health than Western society. And he was comparing their diets and said, well, one of the differences is that they eat more fiber. And so maybe that is the key. But the difference between, I think the fundamental difference between the Western diet and that diet was not the amount of fiber per se, but the amount of non-fibrous carbohydrates that the fiber was taking the place of. And so until you can tease those apart, you can't really draw any conclusion. And then people would say, well, fiber, it reduces blood sugar spikes. Once again, that really only comes into play if your baseline diet has a lot of non-fibrous carbohydrates in it. If you completely remove the non-fibrous carbohydrates, which I have, then there's no need for fiber to come in and reduce the blood sugar spike because there's not a blood sugar spike in the first place.
So it's like the
So that
fiber,
argument falls
they're
apart.
basically measuring like a high sugar diet. If you give somebody a donut and then you give them some fiber, it's going to slow down the absorption of that glucose. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the fiber's great. It just maybe means that it's helping to mitigate the negative effects of this massive glucose and influction, and sucrose and um, fructose.
Right. As to the microbiome, um, it's a really, there are different angles to talk about that from. I think that the there's a lot of excitement, and there should be because it's a vast new field with many things that we're learning about. But one of the base assumptions that people who are working in the area have is that the associations we see between the the strains and the characteristics of the microbiome in healthy people who eat high carb diets are are not just associations but are causal, um, and they can be applied to people who are not on high carb diets. And I just think that's fundamentally flawed. It's like the rest of the RDA things. You can't necessarily base what a person needs um, by looking at what a person on a high carb diet needs if the person isn't in the high carb diet population. Um, for example, some minerals don't get absorbed. So if you take zinc levels, you can see Georgia Eade has a beautiful slide that she got from some research on zinc absorption where they have oysters. You see the blood level of the zinc go up way up after you've eaten oysters. But if you ate it with a tortilla, it just falls to the floor. It just doesn't get absorbed. So now if you have a zinc RDA that's based on this, that's based on the presumption that you're eating tortillas, imagine you take the tortilla out, maybe your RDA isn't the same.
Yeah, these are. I mean, people. I don't. Some people might not be understanding like the weight of these arguments. I mean, these are actually really, really valid points. Where it's like the RDA for almost all of these so-called micronutrients might be completely contextually determined by environmental factors, including diet, and maybe even other factors. I mean, there could be altitude and oxygen availability could affect the requirement for certain nutrients. I mean, just like with iron, it seems to. But yeah, I mean that's a really really good freaking point. Now, what do you think about like the microbiota diversity stuff? Have you? I know you've probably talked to tons of people who've been doing carnivorous diet over the years. You probably get so many people who've given you anecdotal stuff. Have you ever seen anybody do microbiota testing before and after carnivorous style diet?
Um, I have not. I think that's a really interesting thing to do. But again, we've got to be careful of the assumptions. So you brought up diversity. Actually, there is one person I heard from on Twitter who happened to mention that he gets these microbiome tests all the time, and he had his best diversity score after going zero carb, and that really surprised me. But I want to just call into question the whole diversity thing because I think there's a bit of a cart before the horse. The only evidence, there may be more, I haven't looked into it recently, but the last time I really tried to chase down where people were getting the idea that diversity was desirable was from a single study on Hadza people, comparing them to a Western group. And they said, well, the Hadza people are more healthy than this Western group and they have better gut diversity. And that every other paper that I've looked at assumes this and cites that paper. And so I'm not even necessarily, maybe diversity is good, but I'm not sure that that's the case. I think that the, a healthy microbiome must be the microbiome of a healthy person. And right now, all we've got is this associations between people who are healthy and certain characteristics of the biome, and we're trying to transfer those associations without being careful about causality.
So making the assumption that that our biome should look like a Hadza biome, or even like a maybe even a so-called hunter-gatherer biome, right? Or the like the Maasai, right? So I mean, if you were to take the Hadza biome and then blindly look at somebody from the Maasai's microbiome and extrapolate from the Hadza microbiome, you might be making the assumption that these Maasai warriors are unhealthy because perhaps they have less diversity than the Hadza, but that would be just a total assumption. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Another way to turn it on its head is to think about, well, what's the microbiome doing? What it's doing is it's showing up in response to what you're giving it to eat. And so if you say all these people who are healthy and are eating a lot of grains and a lot of cabbage, for example, have these strains in their gut. Now, if you take away the grains and you take away the cabbage, and different strains come in response to what's now there, um, all that, in a way, all that really is a reflection of the food supply. It doesn't necessarily tell you anything else except it mirrors what you're giving it. And so you might say, um, I'm having a lot of trouble digesting cabbage, but if I eat sauerkraut or if I take certain prebiotics when I eat my cabbage, it doesn't give me as much intestinal problems. Um, in a way, all you could say, all you're doing is you're giving your gut the tools it needs to cope with certain plant matter. Um, and if you aren't going to eat that plant matter, um, there's no actual benefit beyond that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like the fibers feeding gut microbiota. But does the gut microbiota need to be there if the fiber's not there? And I mean, even you could even look at it as like maybe the gut microbiota is there to protect us from some of the potentially harmful effects that maybe could be hormetic in smaller doses, but perhaps are detrimental if we have gut permeability issues. I mean, where do you stand on that? I mean, just like the uh, the viability of plants as food in general. I mean, after 9 years of eating a carnivorous diet, um, what do you feel about plants now? What do you see them as?
Well, I kind of, you ever walk by Play-Doh or plastic toys?
Yeah, all
It's a little
day.
bit like that. I just don't see them as food. But I acknowledge that you can get nutrients and certain needs met by eating plants, absolutely. And I think that evolutionarily we took advantage of that, and it's a great survival advantage to be able to get your nutrient needs met by a variety of different sources. And I would never deny that probably most humans can eat plants without problems. When I don't know why it is that some of us have more difficulty than other people, but I see it a little bit the way that I see carbohydrates. So we know that there are societies, hunter-gatherer societies, who have a much higher level of carbohydrate intake than, say, the Inuit or the Maasai did, and they're not sick. So we can't necessarily say carbs are killing people, carbs are necessarily bad for health. Same view with plants, that I think they can be part of a healthy diet. But with carbohydrates, if you have metabolic syndrome, if you have diabetes, carbohydrates are not going to serve you, and getting them out of your diet is the best thing to do, and it's not going to hurt you to do so. And I feel the same way about plants. If you empirically determine that you feel better not eating plants, there's no reason to do that, and it's different from claiming that the plants are necessarily harmful in all situations.
Yeah, I think with the way the internet is, and people in general, like we tend to take things to extremes, especially with with how kind of how our modern civilization is. People are so fractured, and I mean, common beliefs and communities are kind of few and far between nowadays. So I think a lot of people are looking for something to latch onto, and diet often becomes kind of a surrogate religion for a lot of people, and either plants or meat can become the devil in this surrogate religion. And yeah, it's an interesting thing because for me, I see it really similarly. I see plants. I have no intention to really eat them. They don't make me hungry. They don't look like food to me. Me and my wife watched this video, and it's funny because we used to eat so much vegetable matter, and we thought it was great. I loved vegetables, but now I just find
Me
myself
too.
feeling great without them. We were watching somebody make some recipe the other day. It was just some recipe video, and it's like all these vegetables that they're chopping up and steaming and preparing. We're just, why? What's the point? That's kind of how I see it now. It's like, yeah, you could eat those things, but maybe I'd only eat them if I had to. That's kind of it's kind of how I feel about it. Now, in what situations might people want to perhaps consider maybe removing some of these plants from their diet? Why might some people who have been doing, say, like I don't know, maybe like a standard ketogenic diet that included fermented foods, vegetables, high fiber foods, why might or what portions of these populations might want to look into perhaps reducing dietary fiber intake and reducing the plant matter in their diet?
Well, I think there are three or maybe four different things that come to mind. Um, the first one is an autoimmune disease. So a lot of people who have, say, asthma or arthritis or other autoimmune-like conditions have found, just by experimenting, that they got improvement by dropping all plants um, from their diet in a way that they didn't on just a ketogenic diet. Similarly, people with mood disorders, and one might argue that mood disorders maybe have an autoimmune component, and I'm not sure what I think about that yet, but I think it's plausible. And then there's people who have digestive disorders, which also are often autoimmune. So ulcerative colitis, for example, or bloating, inability, feelings that digestion is not working properly, are often extremely responsive to removing all the plant matter. And then the fourth one is just people who really like to experiment and are curious about it. I wouldn't want to leave those people out.
It seems like there's quite a few people that are curious and doing this. They don't really, they're not being forced into it through autoimmune conditions and stuff like that. There are even people doing it for performance now, which I find surprising. Um, Now, here, I want to kind of ask a little bit more about your personal diet, like what you've learned over the years. When you first started out eating a carnivorous diet, what were you eating? Like in the very beginning, year one, 9 years ago, what did you start out eating? Like, what was your daily menu like? If you can bring us on a little trip down memory lane.
Well, it was a long time ago. I started with a lot of steak, but I also ate anything that was already in my diet and was fatty and meat. So I ate a lot of chicken thighs, I ate a lot of pork chops. Um, those are the big three. Oh, ground beef, of course. That's fairly easy to come by and affordable. And then I started branching out more into things like Liver, I happen to love liver. It wasn't that I was worried about the nutrients, although you can certainly make a plausible argument about that. I started eating a lot of ribs because they are delicious and really fatty, and started trying different cuts. I was not very good at cooking meat. I grew up in a vegetarian household and I became a good cook at a young age, but cooking, stir frying vegetables or baking things, it's just a completely different skill set. What works for plants just doesn't work for meat. So it was a big learning curve for me. Um, yeah, so nothing really extraordinary. I got more into oysters later and started eating more rare and sometimes even raw food as part of my diet. Now, this year, my great leveling up is that I was able to get brains, pork and lamb brains, and found that I really like those as well. So that's something
Yeah,
I eat from time to
I'm a
time.
weirdo too. I think with the last video I put out, no, maybe two couple videos ago, was just eating some brains. I'm a really big fan of brain. What type do you like better, cow or you mentioned lamb and sheep?
So far, I've only had lamb and pork,
Okay.
and I'm not sure which I like better. They're both pretty good. They're so creamy.
I got veal
Really good.
brain yesterday. Like
Wow.
yeah, so they had slaughtered an animal and then she was pregnant. And so then there was, a probably maybe a month or two shy of birth fetus in the cow, and I had him get the brain for me. It was really interesting. It was much less. You didn't have all the wrinkles that they have when they're mature, and it was
Wow.
yeah, it was like a blob. It was really interesting. So creamy, so buttery, very tiny, and we got the liver too, which I know you really like liver. This was the first time I've ever had really, really young, like, I mean, here they call it ternero. We're in Ecuador. So ternero is the same, like you translate it to veal. But in the U.S., veal is like 6 months and less, I think, uh, like 6 months old and less baby. This was, fetal uh, liver. And it was so interesting. It had none of that funkiness that liver usually has. It almost tasted to me like tomato. Um,
Wow.
Yeah. Do you ever do like
So kind of tangy.
very tangy? My wife said it tasted like blackberry, but I mean, she always perceives sweet much more than I do. She thinks everything like because we never eat anything sweet, so she thinks everything tastes really sweet. Like browned butter tastes sweet to us. But yeah,
Oh
it was
yeah.
amazing. It tasted. Yeah, are you a fan of butter? You do butter still?
I do. I don't eat as much butter as I used to in the beginning. After I started getting more into reserving tallow and lard. At first, I used to fry most of my food, and the lard and the tallow would get sort of scorched. But I started doing things like bacon and ribs in the oven in a pan that I can collect the fat from, and it's much clearer and more pleasant, doesn't get other tastes in it. And now that I have such a big backlog of tallow and lard, I rely on butter less. But absolutely, butter is very sweet to me as well.
Yeah, it's amazing how much the palate changes. So nowadays, what does your menu look like now? You mentioned you weren't that good at cooking meat. You're better at vegetables and stuff. Like what are you into now? What have you been eating this week?
This week, I actually had some leaner things. I had some strip steak and I had bacon, I had eggs. I told you, Tristan, that I had a really bad experience with eggs. I actually got salmonella a couple of weeks ago from almost certainly from a sunny side up egg where the white wasn't fully cooked. And I've been eating eggs for like all my life. Even as a vegetarian, I ate eggs, and that's never happened to me. So uh, this week was the first time I dared have eggs again. um, but yeah,
That
so
puts you out. I mean, how I think people get concerned about I don't know, food poisoning and stuff when you're eating a lot of meat. And it's funny because since I've transitioned to kind of eating a basically all animal food diet. In the last couple of years, I can't remember. I don't know when the last time I made vegetables was, or intentionally ate vegetables, but it must have been like a year and a half, maybe even longer. But I haven't gotten food poisoning from it yet. Like, I haven't had this experience. I eat raw egg yolks like every day. I eat raw meat regularly now, even though I used to be afraid of it. I got kind of gotten beyond that fear. But yeah, what's up with like the food poisoning fears that people have? Like, is this a legitimate concern with animal foods? Are you more likely to get harmful side effects and bacterial stuff from animals than you are from plant foods?
Well, from just a reporting statistics basis, it's almost equivalent plant sources of foodborne illness and animal sources of foodborne illness uh, when you're eating them raw. So if you're going to pick on me for eating my ground beef out of the refrigerator, then don't go eat your spinach salad and in front of me. But that said, if you're just looking at reports, people tend to eat vegetables raw a lot more commonly than they do eat meat raw. So that is a bias in the statistics in favor of the meat. So it may be the case that there is a higher risk in animal products, but one of the things that you can do is just be careful about where you source it, or you can take steps like searing the outside if you're talking about a ground meat where there's more surface area versus a steak. That can be safer. But even though I had this bad experience, I still am pretty much cavalier about eating raw, just as I would never have batted an eyelash at eating raw strawberries. No one's insisting that you cook your strawberries, and I'm not going to feel any more pull to cook my meat than I did then. But I acknowledge it's a risk. It is a risk. It's just probably much lower risk than people are led to believe.
Yeah, I mean, in my kind of vegan days, I definitely got sick more. I don't know if it would have been immune compromise issues or what, but I definitely think like I was more susceptible to foodborne illness and stuff like that. Of course, lots of abrasive fiber that was coming down the hatch back then too. So, um, yeah.
Well, in terms of illness, just anecdotally, the first 8 years or 7 years that I was carnivorous, I had one bout of laryngitis at Christmas time. No, not a single cold, not a single bacterial illness, not a single flu, and even I used to get cold sores about once or twice a year, and I didn't have those. So I felt I started to feel invincible. And in the last 2 years, I have had two sinusitis bouts, but I still to this day have never not had yet a viral illness. And I don't know what the deal is with that, because I had it plenty on a low carb ketogenic diet.
Well,
It could be a coincidence.
the critics are going to say that low carb diets now cause sinusitis because you had that in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on there, and I would, in the first 6 months, you might say it's a coincidence, but who goes 9 years without getting a virus? Certainly not I. before that point. So just when you look at the sheer frequency over time, you have to at a certain point say something's going on here.
Absolutely. I mean, even just anecdotally myself too. My I always had chronic allergies as a kid. I grew up with allergies and asthma. I always used to have my inhaler with me all the time. My nose. So after a few years on a ketogenic diet, everything had improved drastically. But what I noticed is that without any plants at all, my nose, it's like I can breathe better than I ever have through my nose. And it feels like it's clearing up. So, of course, anecdotal, but that's the best we can do now. I mean, how are you going to do, controlled double-blind studies on diet? It's basically impossible, and especially in, with the way that the medical system works now, nobody's going to fund these studies. So, unfortunately, it seems like anecdotal stuff is going to have to be considered at least to a certain extent, by a lot of people out there now who are looking at these kind of alternative pathways of, alternative dietary pathways. So, what do you think about the research out there and kind of there's always a lot of arguments about what does the research show to be the best diet for human beings. I mean, is there any interesting research pointing to benefits or drawbacks to a kind of a carnivorous style diet, low fiber diet like you've been eating for the last 9 years?
Well, it, I haven't found anything that's led me to believe there are going to be problems as a hypothesis. So there's no nutrient that I'm worried about getting, for example, and there's no I followed the fiber idea as far as I could and didn't find anything that really made me worried from that standpoint. But as far as science to show that this is actually going to help with certain conditions, we're on much we have much less to go on other than people's experiences, which is a great starting point. But as you say, it's extremely difficult to double blind diet. um, so you have to start looking at things like, well, what what kind of prior uh, probability was there for something going into remission? And so if you have a disease that tends to go into remission all the time, then it's going to be a lot harder to show that what you've done actually caused the remission than if it's something that's very steady and has very measurable kinds of effects on you. But one of the great things about a carnivorous diet in particular is that the risk, the cost to benefit, the risk to reward ratio is so favorable. So there's no real downside to trying it, except that you might get weird social situations. I mean, some pretty serious social situations, depending on what kind of environment you're in. But that's really the biggest cost as far as I can tell. And so trying it out and seeing what happens for you. I mean, look at even the worst case. Suppose that my bipolar remission is completely a figment of my imagination. Um, so is it so bad that I'm stuck eating all meat in order to keep that illusion alive? Maybe not. I don't think that it's a placebo effect at all. I think there are many reasons that it can't be. But even in the worst case, from a scientific point of view, suppose my mind is that powerful. Well, then, why not? There's nothing that's hurting me here. And that's the great thing about it.
Now, what are some of the difficulties that people might experience when they're transitioning into a more carnivorous style diet or a carnivore keto style diet? And then we can kind of get into some of the ins and outs of like macros and stuff like that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that next. But yeah, what are some of the difficulties in adaptation that people might experience?
Well, if you're not already keto adapted, then you're going to go through keto adaptation. And there seems to be a lot of variability in how much of a hit people take for that. I know that a lot of people, they've got 4 or maybe 5 days of reduced energy, maybe some headaches, maybe cravings, and then that's it. That's all they've really got. I think that people who are more athletic are going to notice deficits in performance for longer that a person who isn't really athletic might notice. But that's all just part of keto. So if you're going from keto to carnivore, I personally experienced no transition physiologically at all. There was no downside. But I have heard of many people who feel like they've had a kind of second keto adaptation period of a similar nature and a similar duration.
Yeah, I noticed that a lot of people who are notice the same thing. You're coming out of a ketogenic diet, you're already adapted to fat. A lot of times people just feel better. A lot of times long-term keto advocates that I know have transitioned as well to a lesser fiber diet and just feel better in general. Now, I mean, obviously it's kind of, speculation here. We don't have, research to pan out, but why do you think so many people are experiencing benefits from this? Like, what do you think is going on physiologically that's making it difficult for us to digest plants? Is it Is it that the plants are bad, or are there other factors going on that might be affecting our gut, making us unable to really digest them well?
That's such a great question. For the first few years, I was so in the dark and so baffled. I've learned a few things. My first few hypotheses were along the lines of um, I'm really carb sensitive, and it really is about the carbs. And even the tiny amount that is there is affecting my carbohydrate metabolism. I decided that wasn't really the case because things like liver and eggs and even cream and cheese have carbs, and they don't affect me that way. And then I thought, well, maybe I have some kind of like candida or fungal infection that is eating these plants, and what happens is if I give them even a little bit of this material, they're making me ill. One of the reasons that I abandoned that theory is because I decided at one point when I was feeling well to take a bunch of supplements that are specifically designed to combat candida. So there was concentrated garlic and maybe powdarco and a couple other herbal things. And within 1 week, I found myself lying in my bed, looking at the ceiling, wishing I was dead. And I thought, wait a minute, I've been here before. What's going on? And I cut out all the supplements and my mood restored. So I don't I don't think that it came down to fueling those organisms, although I suppose you could still make an argument that there is a microorganism responsible for that. But beyond those theories, I started learning, and this came mostly from visiting the Paleomedicina group in Hungary. They they treat people with chronic diseases using a plant-free diet, and their therapeutic diet is different from the kind of I was going to say mainstream, but the carnivorous diet that you see me or Sean Baker or other people eating is very hands off about things like macronutrients and even micronutrients and types of food. Now, what they suggest is a very ketogenic kind of carnivorous diet, which has to include organs and it has to be a certain ratios. But nonetheless, they don't use plants, and that's an integral part of their program. And the science that they are pursuing for why they believe this works all has to do with intestinal permeability. And so we know we have all these phytochemicals and plant toxins that specifically evolved in every plant that survived reproduction had to fight being eaten. And so there are these low levels of toxins that many of them have effects on intestinal permeability. And so my the idea that I think has the most promise at this point for why these diets are so helpful is that we're repairing the intestinal permeability that's caused by the toxins in plants, or that's worsened by toxins in plants if it's already existing from other things.
So another kind of in and out of keto slash carnivore diet. Now a lot of people are concerned of some people like chase ketones, right? They think that more ketones equals better. I'm definitely not a proponent of chasing ketones, but would you say that a carnivore diet is not ketotic? Is ketotic? You got a lot of different people out there wondering about, these definitions. And what are your thoughts on that? Carnivory and ketosis, are these compatible?
Yes, so that's a great question. Protein is self-limiting. There's I don't think that anyone can eat more than a certain percentage of their calories from protein without starting to feel ill. But I don't think you have to necessarily plan that into your diet, because I think your appetite will lead you. So if you just tell a person, choose fatty meats as a heads up guide, you're going to feel better that way, but eat more fat if you feel like more fat and more protein if you feel like more protein. Generally, everyone seems to fall within this macro range of somewhere around 65 to 80% fat. So that's already, it's not going to be highly ketogenic. It's not going to necessarily put you into the 1.5 millimole range, but it's probably going to put you into the 0.5 range, which, at least according to people like Finney, is where we start to see benefits from nutritional ketosis anyway. That said, I don't think that there's much evidence that maybe 1 or 1.5 millimoles of beta hydroxybutyrate in the blood is associated with better outcomes in certain diseases than 0.5 is. But beyond some level, the returns start diminishing rapidly. I don't think there's any reason that anyone would ever need to try to get 5 millimoles as opposed to 1.5 millimoles unless there's some really specific thing that they're after. I think it's a mistake to use that measurement as if it were a linear measure of how good your diet is.
Right. Like
And
ketones are not really a measurement of health. Just like, well, I like to look at it like this too. I mean, if we look at glucose, right? If you're on a carbohydrate-based diet and you're burning glucose, you don't look at high blood glucose as a sign that you're metabolically healthy. So why would suddenly we flip the script and if we're on a ketogenic diet, high blood ketones equals the panacea of health and longevity? To me, it doesn't make much sense. Like your body probably wants a narrow bandwidth of energy in your blood at any given time. Too much ketones, too much glucose. I don't think your body's going to do too well with either one. But yeah, that's a really good point. I think the chasing ketones thing gets a lot of people lost. Now, I think a lot of people that are transitioning into a carnivorous style diet now are probably coming out of like a keto diet or even like a low carb paleo diet. I think most people who are experimenting with it have already experienced low carbohydrate diets. So what would you say like a good way to start out on a carnivorous style diet is? Like how can people start out on this? What should they do? Should they just jump into it? Should they taper out their carbohydrates and titrate them out? Or what would you recommend?
for someone coming from a low carb diet,
For somebody coming from a low carb or ketogenic diet, or even, maybe a standard diet as well. I don't even know what a standard American diet is now, but, I mean,
who really
whatever
follows
people,
that?
yeah, everybody says standard American diet now, but I don't know. I mean, there's probably 1,000 different versions of a standard American diet out there. But yeah, I mean, maybe we'll start with the, ketotic people who are doing a keto diet, and then for people coming from a standard American diet, whatever the hell that even is.
Well, the first thing I think is to mentally prepare. And as I've already said, what worked for me really was defining how long you're going to try it for. And if you're doing it in order to try to address some health problem that you have, figure out how you're going to know if it worked. So that at the end you go, well, I don't know, was that good or bad? Like have some definable way of measuring that. And then I'm not much of a fan of gradually decreasing things. I know that some people that works really, really well for. I know I've seen some people who got to a ketogenic diet first by getting rid of grains and then by getting rid of soda. If you can do that, that's great. But for me, if I tried to remove one kind of sugar, I know I would just replace it with more of another kind of sugar and it wouldn't help me at all. So I'm more of a cold turkey or hot steak kind of a woman. And I would just,
Cold turkey or hot
sorry,
steak, I like that.
I had to throw that in there. But yeah, find foods that you think you can live with, that fit your budget, that you like, and design it. Maybe you don't have to go like plan out every single thing that you're going to eat, but figure out how you're going to do it for the space of time that you think you're going to do it. And I think that 3 weeks to a month is a good trial time in order to start to see the effects. Um, and then just follow through with that and pay attention. Don't try to limit the amount of food that you're eating because ultimately, I don't think that ketosis or calorie restriction has a lot to do with the benefits that most people are seeing. I really think that plant removal is the number one concern. So don't use vegetable oils. Don't use things that are technically zero carb if you can. That's how I would do it. I know that there are other people who advocate sort of be easier on yourself. Like if you need to have mayo or mustard, put it on. But I feel like the more factors that you're leaving in the picture, the less likely you'll be able to determine what is working and what's not.
Yeah, I think a lot of people they tend to like you said, they don't quantify things. So it's like if you're looking for cognitive enhancement or decreased inflammation, finding something to measure to see if you're actually making progress is important. I mean, weight loss, obviously, if your waist is getting smaller, it's important to watch that. But I think a lot of people jump in diet to diet, kind of just looking for something. Like they're looking for kicks, right? They're kind of like, well, what am I going to make my identity about this year? Um, and I think that could become kind of dangerous. People diet hopping constantly like that. Um, what about food quality? What do you think about food quality? Like the sourcing of your foods, grass fed versus grain fed. There are a lot of passionate arguments from both sides on these. Um, yeah, I guess maybe we'll start with grass fed versus grain fed. What do you think about that whole thing?
I have wavered a bit on that. One thing I can tell you for sure is that none of the benefits that the severe, like, drastic benefits that I got in the first several years, in the first couple of weeks, had anything to do with grass fed. I couldn't afford grass fed at that time, and I I got everything that I needed out of completely conventionally raised meat. And so I don't think that there's anything that's going to hold you back if that's what you're going to do. But that doesn't mean that I don't think that grass-fed beef doesn't have better properties. I just think that they're not going to be in that like 80-20 ballpark that you need to see a benefit. What those benefits are, I'm less certain of. I know that people talk about omega-3 to omega-6 ratios, but frankly, I think the amounts of omega-3 and omega-6 in beef are so small that it may be a little bit chasing a detail that's not as important as it could be. If you took all the vegetable oils out, the amount of omega-6 that you're going to get from a cow is not going to be a big deal. Now, a monogastric animal like a chicken or a pork, they're going to have levels that reflect what they eat a lot more than an animal with a rumen. So maybe that's more important if you're looking at those animals.
So yeah, the grass fed versus grain fed, the omega-3, that's an argument. Then also, um, a lot of people would say that perhaps the organs of grain fed animals. Well, first of all, a lot of people say that the organs from grain fed animals taste like shit. I never tried them because it's all grass fed stuff here, so I have no idea if
Lucky
that's
you.
true. Yeah, I don't really know if what is lucky me, but there's not very much fat on grass fed animals, so you gotta.
Right.
I think that's one thing that people have to consider. It's like, look, if you're going for fatty cuts of meat, some people are on a budget. And some people's budget might, just like you said, it might not allow grass fed. So I think, in those cases, like the muscle meat's probably fine. But I've heard it argued that the organs, you'd want a better source of food for the organs. Do you have any opinion on that? If you don't have to force an opinion if you don't have one. But
No, I don't know a lot about that. I like organs, and noticed, I've never noticed that the conventional liver that I've eaten had anything that I didn't like about it. So maybe I don't have a distinguished enough palate to, to know. But
yeah. Or maybe some people just make mountains out of, what do you call it? Mountains out of molehill, something like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think
it could be.
there tend to be a
Or
lot
the
of.
fattiness is a really good point that you brought up. Nowadays I can afford more grass-fed meat, but if I look at the rack and the grass-fed's lean, I'm gonna buy the conventional. It's just I need the fat.
All right, speaking of fat, so that might be a reason why some people might want to go for the conventional meat. I mean, I would say just to close up, as far as like the environmental aspects of it, where I live, I know it's very, very important to focus on grass-fed animals. Now, this is just because the industrial agriculture system has not pushed its way through Ecuador. But if you look at Argentina, and a lot of the other areas in South America where the Rockefeller Foundation kind of set up their roots, and even Nelson Rockefeller bought thousands of hectares of land in Venezuela and Argentina, of ranch land, and but the environmental degradation of the feedlot stuff, it does seem there are some convincing arguments there, absolutely. And I definitely don't want to see feedlots in Ecuador because first of all, we don't have a massive influx of GMO crops and glyphosate use, which glyphosate does seem to have a negative effect on the gut microbiome and human health in general. But yeah, it seems like the environmental argument for grass-fed animals might be pretty strong, but the apologist angle would be, well, you have larger animals when they're grain-fed. You have less pollution because less animals to produce more meat are required. So, there are arguments both ways. Do you have any opinion on kind of the ethical side of sourcing meat? Do you think about that much?
Well, I care about the welfare of the animal, and I like to see animals who have a situation that's more comfortable and natural for them. And I also think that there's so much grassland or potential grassland that we could be using that is not being tapped, that we could benefit from taking advantage of that by raising livestock on it. I'm not sure, it's not. Maybe it's a mistake to think of it as a feedlot versus grass in terms of grain, because maybe you can add a little bit of grain at the end to increase the fat or get a better yield without necessarily putting the animals in as bad a situation as the worst of the worst in the US. So I do care about the sustainability and the lives of the animals for sure. And if there's any way I can vote with my dollars for that when I have the ability to, I will.
Yeah, that's a really good point. No, I think, obviously human health, very important. You want your fatty cuts of meat, and the making like a line in the sand between, well, this is grass-fed or this is conventional. I think it can be short-sighted there because there's a lot of nuance, and that's actually something I forgot to preface. Whereas like even grain-finished animals, they're spending most of their lives on pasture. It's not economically viable. It's not like the cow's born in a cage and you just got corn puffs coming down a funnel into its mouth all day. That's not even economically viable. It's like these animals are pastured and then they're grain finished, which that is something that people have been doing for thousands of years, fattening up their animals with some grain. I mean, even several thousand years ago, in like biblical times, they talk about a fatted calf, where they would they'd finish it off by feeding it grain to fatten the animal up in order to convert nutrition from these grains into fats and fat-soluble vitamins that we can consume. So I don't think that's necessarily bad to feed an animal some grain. And I think these are issues I would love to see explored more deeply, and maybe touch on more on this channel in the future. What about like raw versus cooked meat? You see, of course, like in every dietary extreme, it's like you're gonna go on a more so-called extreme diet. There's some people who've got to take it to the utmost extreme. So you've got some people out there who are like raw or nothing. If you're not eating it raw, if your meat was ever frozen, you're a subhuman. If you're not eating your meat totally raw, you're a wussy and you're not doing it right. What do you think about like the raw versus cooked as far as nutrition goes?
As far as nutrition goes, well, certainly there are some vitamins or enzymes that can be degraded by cooking. Cooking, again, is a nuanced thing. I mean, are you talking about cooking something to medium or cooking something to well done? That makes a difference. There's, for example, vitamin C. Vitamin C gets destroyed by heat to a certain extent, but I think that if you're eating it medium, you're still going to get what you need. On the other hand, I don't think there's any reason to like one-up someone by saying, well, I ate mine raw and you ate yours cooked, so I'm more of a carnivore than you are.
More carnivorer than thou. You're a carnivorer than thou here.
I happen to, here's another confession, but when I was before I started on a carnivorous diet, I was that person who liked their steak well done. I don't know what I was thinking, but I think that I didn't I ate a lot of I liked spices because I came from this vegetarian tradition. My favorite foods were Indian foods or Mexican foods that were heavily spiced, and I relied a lot on the what what I now see as condiments to carry the taste of my food even when it came to meat. And as soon as I started eating only meat, my palate cleared up because I didn't use any spices and not even salt at that time when I started. And I began to actually taste the flavor of meat that I never had to that extent before I started eating this way. And now I feel like um, the rarer it is, to a point, the rarer it is, the better it tastes. And so um, I don't even I don't even like ground beef cooked anymore. Um, Steak, I like to be a little bit cooked. I don't know why the difference there, but ground beef I find just gets kind of tough and dried out when you cook it in a way that makes it much better when it's raw. But that's just a personal preference, and I don't think there's any um, demand that my body is making that requires it to be that way, which is the opposite of plants, right? Plants, a lot of plants, well, maybe not so much now. We've bred some plants that are a lot more edible, but a lot of the plants that we had access to before agriculture just weren't edible without cooking. And that's not the case with meat. Meat is perfectly edible while it's raw in a way that plants aren't.
That's funny you said that because I think it's a common argument from vegetarians and vegans. Well, meat, we're not natural meat eaters, obviously, because you got to cook your meat and you got to put spices on it just to make it taste good. But yeah, I mean, I have noticed very similar. Like, I love the taste of raw meat. And if a steak is cooked too much, I don't like it very much at all. And, but yeah, I mean, when I'm making steak, sometimes if there's like a little odd cut while I'm cutting it, I'll eat the raw stuff. I'll eat the ends of it raw, um, and I find that it digests really really well. So yeah, I think the vegans and the vegetarians out there saying that you got to cook your meat or you got to process it in this way to make it edible. Um, you can't go out into a field and pick some wheat or even lentils or beans or soy or corn or any of these foods and eat them raw. Corn is the closest thing. You might be able to stomach some of that raw corn. But with meat, I mean, fresh meat is totally digestible. My 2-year-old son can eat raw meat and it just melts in your mouth depending on the cut. So I think there's a lot to be said there just as far as like the bioavailability and are we meant to eat meat or not. You can eat that shit raw, but you're not going to go eat wheat raw.
No, and even like you brought up lentils. Can you imagine eating even cooked lentils with no spice on it day after day? It kind of tastes like dirt.
Have you ever
Like
had?
really.
Have you ever had?
And I love lentils, but not by themselves.
I used to like lentils too, but always you got to have a lot of butter on them or something, right? Like they need, rice. For when I was a kid, it was a carrier for butter and salt. And it's like if I'm gonna have rice, there's gonna be so much butter on that rice. Um, and beans, like if you undercook beans, anybody out there who's ever undercooked beans, like I have, you know that it's not fun. It's not a pretty sight, and your toilet will hate you. So yeah,
Well,
but
some of them are downright toxic.
yeah. Yeah, black beans. I
Legumes
undercooked
too.
black beans. I thought I was gonna die. I was like puking out the window 20 minutes later. It was horrible.
Glad
Uh,
you made it.
yeah, I made it out the other side. I don't think I've tried to eat beans since then. So all right, so 9 years carnivore. 9 years. What are there any? Is there any downside to it? What would be like the most? What would be the hardest part of it? What's the worst part about it? We've talked about a lot of the benefits. What's difficult about it?
Most of the time I don't think about other foods and I don't miss them at all. But when I have had the opportunity to visit other countries where I'm not familiar with the cuisine, I I'm sorry that I can't join in to try the traditional foods of those places. I think um, that's a shame. that's something that I would have liked.
Do you think
That
that?
said,
Okay.
that said, because my response to a carnivorous diet was so fast and so uh, complete, I do feel like if there were an occasion in my life where it really meant a lot to me, I could pay the price and be back okay in a week at most. So there is that.
Are you sure that there would be a price to pay? I mean, when's the last time you had something that was off diet? You know, I mean, do you think you might be able to handle some of these foods? Like if you were to maybe steam some sort of vegetables or even a legume properly prepared, what do you think? What do you expect would happen?
That is a fair question. Um, I think the last time that I experimented with something was a couple of years ago. I had I had this notion. I was thinking about the phytotoxins in plants and thinking, well, what about fiber? Fiber doesn't have those toxins in it. It's not like one of these rainbow vegetables that is supposed to be a strong source of antioxidants or other kind of magical chemicals that might be hurting me. So what would happen if I just had some psyllium? And so I took some in my coffee. I was going to have 1 week, I was going to have a spoon of psyllium in my coffee every day. Um, the first time that I tried it, within a couple of hours, I had an unexpected episode of it. Started out, I was at work, I was in the office, and I couldn't focus. I just felt like there were too many demands on my brain. It's hard to explain because it's almost like a sensory overload. I couldn't figure out how to focus on my job the way that I could. So I decided to go outside and sit in my car and take a break. And I ended up having a sobbing fit. It, it was just extraordinary, the effect that it had in such a short time on my brain. So I know that some things can be really extreme, and I don't know all the answers as to why. That said, I'm sure that there's got to be some plants that aren't going to affect me at all. Like maybe I don't want to guess because I could be completely wrong, but maybe lettuce is not actually a problem for me. Oh, so I sometimes go to a restaurant and eat sashimi, and when I do, I always have the wasabi and the soy. And sometimes, here's a, another confession. Sometimes, if I run out of fish and I haven't run out of wasabi, I'll dip some of that daikon in. I've never had a bad consequence from eating shredded daikon. So maybe daikon's perfectly safe for me. I don't know.
It seems like it's a lower, like daikon's pretty low in fiber, right? It's like more water. It's like more of a watery thing, isn't it?
It's all water and fiber. It's certainly not the kind of concentrated fiber in dried psyllium husk.
Yeah.
So it's not
Yeah.
that level.
How
Yeah.
interesting. But it sounds, it sounds like it was like a anxiety slash panic attack. I mean, the overloading of the senses, I mean, all of that people, when you're experiencing depression, anxiety, it seems like that was just a acute attack of like depressive anxiety. That's crazy.
Yeah, and you're the second person to mention that when I described that story because I've never had an anxiety or panic attack, so I didn't know what that was like, and I had no name for that other than to describe what happened. But I think that might actually be what people mean by panic attack. That might be exactly what it was.
Or you could have been a victim. Somebody could have just dosed you with LSD and you didn't know. One of those.
It's possible.
Possible. Sketchy office workers over there. Well, what about salt and electrolytes? That's another thing. A lot of people, I tend to eat so much frickin' salt, it's ridiculous. I mean, even on a carnivorous style diet, I know a lot of people they'll salt their food to taste and stuff, but man, I'll find myself tossing back a half teaspoon of salt before a workout sometimes. If I sweat a lot, I find I need more sodium. And I've talked to people who are like, yeah, dude, I don't think about salt. I barely salt my food, and I'm great. And it works for them. So, what is your theory on electrolytes, and what do you do about the sodium and all that stuff?
I don't salt my food. I started when I started the carnivorous diet, I started without salt and I never had any problems with it. And so um, I just never brought it back. I have played around with it a little in the past couple of years because there was sort of a salt craze. and people saying, like, Dave Feldman, for example, he told me that he had he found that adding salt to his ketogenic diet made a huge difference in his fatigue and energy levels. And so I haven't been very systematic, but I've tried adding salt now and then for a couple of days at a time and never noticed any particular difference. Early on, I did try supplementing with magnesium. And what happened there, I think it was about, I don't know if it was 6 months into it or if it was a year and 6 months into it, but I tried adding magnesium, the slow mag tablets, and that within a couple of days, I was feeling absolutely euphoric. And I thought, oh my gosh, I must have had a magnesium deficiency. But within a couple of weeks, that subsided, and I kept taking it. And maybe another month later, I stopped taking it. And then I thought later, several months later, maybe I should check into that again. And I tried the magnesium, and I had no difference. So my speculation there was that I had had a magnesium deficiency that I hadn't ever really caught up with just from diet. But once it was addressed, it was never a problem again. As to other electrolytes, the only times I've taken them, every now and again, still, it's kind of surprising to me, but every now and again I will get leg cramps at night. And so I sometimes take them symptomatically for that. And I've also taken them when I've done some experimentation with fasting. But as a general rule, it's not something I think about.
So electrolytes doesn't seem to be, supplementation doesn't seem to be a net positive for you. It seems to be neutral at best.
There's nothing that I've noticed that it could be helping. I mean, someone might argue that I have a long-term deficit going on, but other than that experience with magnesium, I haven't seen any evidence that that's the case.
How often do you get leg cramps? Because, I know, a lot of people blame leg cramps on magnesium deficiency. But when you look at the literature, it doesn't really flesh out. But it does seem to help acute leg cramping. Like magnesium supplementation does seem to help, at least anecdotally. But as far as the research that I've seen, it doesn't seem to be like a causal link. But yeah, do you get leg cramps often, or is it just like every once in a while you get something?
I have two different experiences with leg cramps. One was that in 2014 and lasting for about a year, I had leg cramps come out of the blue every night. And the more electrolytes I took, it seemed like the worse they got. And that just went on for some time, and then it resolved. And I have no idea why or what that was. But I know that that was also at the lowest point in my weight. I've since gained weight, and I wonder if it has something to do with losing weight. I don't know. Mystery. The second thing that I know is that almost every time I drink alcohol, I will wake up with leg cramps. And so I think that, alcohol acutely depletes magnesium, and that's probably just a really simple situation there going on.
What about like sleep quality? Some people when they transition to a keto diet or something, some people say that they feel like it's harder to get to sleep. Sometimes people get like heart palpitations and stuff, and usually correcting for electrolytes seems to balance that out. Like, have you found that your sleep quality has been affected at all over the last few years with your, well, not just few years, 9 years, almost a decade of eating meat?
Yeah.
Yeah, do you find your sleep is affected negatively or positively?
I think I sleep better. I sleep great. But I've never had an acute problem with insomnia. I did not have, I've never had insomnia associated with higher ketones, though I've definitely heard that as an anecdote from other people. But I'm a light sleeper, and I always have been. And I continue to wake up periodically through the night, but I almost never, um, I just go right back to sleep as soon as I close my eyes. I haven't felt like that's been affected.
All right. I got a few people in the chat. I had like 10 people asking about coffee. I keep asking about coffee. What about coffee, Amber?
What about coffee? So, when I started this diet, it was going to be a really temporary thing. And the people that I was learning it from were agnostic about coffee, and I was a coffee addict already at that point for many years. And so I kept coffee in my diet. And pretty much the whole 9 years, I have been a coffee drinker. And I've never, again, it's like with the grass fed, I didn't require getting rid of coffee to get the benefits that I got. But a couple of times over the past few years, I have quit coffee. One time I quit it for a month. That was about 2.5 years ago. And I saw no particular benefit from going off it. So that wasn't very motivating to continue to quit it because I enjoy coffee. And then this year, I quit coffee for the entire summer. So I had my last cup of coffee on June 21st, and I had zero coffee all the way through to 2 days ago. I had my first cup of coffee. And
Wow.
so, because I thought, this really deserves another and maybe a longer go. And as far as I can tell, there's been no, um, I had some lower points of mood over the summer. Um, I wouldn't call it depression, definitely not depression, but I had lower points of mood over the summer than I'm used to having, and it's possible that's attributable to the lack of coffee. But basically, I saw no detriment from not having it, and since I've reintroduced it, I've seen no consequence again from having it after not having had it, except I went a little overboard and had some jitters on Saturday. um, but
Yeah.
other than that stupidly predictable thing, I don't see that coffee is necessarily, for me, something that's compromising my health. Can't guarantee it won't be beneficial for someone else to do it.
All right, so 9 years on carnivore. Do you know anybody else? I mean, you've got the Anderson family, and I know they've been around for a long time. They're hard to get a hold of. I found them on Instagram now, so maybe I'll be able to get a hold of one of them. I'd love to interview one of the Anderson clan now that everything's calmed down. But it seems like they had a lot of backlash. Like there was an article, and was that on your site? Was that Zero Carb Zen where you had the interview with them?
Zerocarb Zen
I'm
is
sorry.
the site of Esme Lafleur,
Yeah.
and that is exactly what happened. They had an interview, and they, I don't know if they might have even gotten death threats. Like,
I think they did.
people
It
were
sounded like
so
they did.
angry that they were feeding their children this diet that they were threatening towards them, and they just said, you know what, take it off. We don't want to have to deal with that. It's a great shame because they were really pioneers. They were on that group Zeroing In on Health when I joined, as people who are like me now, who'd already been on the diet for a decade. And so that was really inspiring to have people right there to consult with about what they did and what worked for them. And I think that's really valuable. Those are the people that I know of that have been doing it the longest. But there are also people who are a year or two ahead of me that were on that forum, like Charles Washington and Dana Spencer, whom I mentioned, and other people that were in that group, and probably people who are less social and do that and just don't talk about it. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, it's always interesting to
yeah,
find, somebody if you're trying something out and it maybe is not so accepted in the mainstream, it might be a lot. It's really beneficial psychologically to talk to somebody at least who's done what you want to do, and can tell you, hey, it's okay. That you're not gonna die. You're not gonna have cholesterol coming out of your eyeballs. You're gonna be okay. Um, so yeah, all right, cool, interesting. So what do you think about all this exposure that like zero carb stuff has been getting now? I mean, do you think this is like it's interesting with the progression of the internet, kind of the way that it's changing the way that media works. We've seen a lot of exposure of zero carb diets, for better or worse. There's been a lot of hit pieces, been a lot of attack pieces, and like the Atlantic, even Time magazine. Oh, no, Time magazine hasn't written it. They did the saturated fat will kill you or something, right? Or no, that was eating more carbs will make you live longer. But there's been a lot of mainstream media attention and kind of backlash coming towards this whole carnivorous style diet thing. What do you think? What do you think the future holds for carnivory? Where do you think this is all going in the next couple years? If you want to throw your Nostradamus hat on.
well, I'll tell you what's been negative about it for me and what I see as positive. Um, w- the negative stuff is really just kind of selfish, really, because it's kind of like the experience someone might have in high school when their favorite obscure band gets popular, and suddenly everybody's on this, and you're like, yeah, come on, where have you been? um, but that's really, of no consequence. I think that the wider variety of the wider reach is actually really, really helpful, because the more people that know that this is an option, no matter what kind of light it's being put in, the more options they're going to have, and the more chances that something that will help them and work for them are. And similarly, the keto diet itself has only really been acceptable in a very closed, small world. Every once in a while, I step out of this world and realize that still everyone that I meet thinks that fat's bad for you, and
It's crazy, right? You
and that
forget. I
whole
literally
grains are healthy,
forget.
right?
I forget all the time, right? You forget all the time that 90% of the world thinks that meat is naughty and you need to balance out your meat with spinach to quench the raging sin inside of your flesh for eating these animal foods. But it's the programming is strong out there. It is hard to get through some of it.
Right. So one thing that I think that the carnivore diet is doing is it's it's beyond ketogenic in its craziness, and therefore I think that a lot of people who might earlier have been really opposed to a ketogenic diet might now say, well, a ketogenic diet's okay as long as you don't go carnivore. That would be crazy. So it kind of stretches the bounds in people's minds. And I also um, when I first heard of a low carb diet, I thought it was the craziest, stupidest, most obviously wrong thing I'd ever heard of. And I didn't look at it again for a few years. And it was only when some paradox came up into my mind where I thought, well, wait a minute, I've heard of something that might be relevant here. So even if people hear about the carnivorous diet and they think that's totally stupid, maybe at some point later in their lives, because of that exposure, they will be able to come revisit it with a more open mind. So I think that's also positive.
So the
Where
downs,
it's going to go, I don't know.
yeah. Right, well, it's like 9 years. Would you have expected this to have happened 9 years ago?
No. I felt like even just 2 years ago, I felt like it was so fringe of the fringe that it would be at most of academic interest. But I was a little bit jaded at that point, because in 1997, when I first discovered low carb and started reading the science behind that, I thought, okay, 5 years from now, this is going to be totally mainstream.
Right, and
And
it's
seeing that not pan out over and over again it really made me think, oh, change requires a lot more than this. And so I might have been at a low point of cynicism about carnivory a couple of years ago that maybe was also more of a pendulum swing than it really deserved.
yeah, that's a good point. Because I mean, well, how do you feel about like the Orthodox medical establishment, Orthodox nutrition establishment? I mean, do you think that where do you? I mean, I'm pretty kind of black pilled on the whole thing. Like, I think it's kind of ridiculous and it's kind of absurd, and it almost seems like just spinning wheels in the mud trying to change much within that system. And the low carb community, it's been something that seems like it's, for the most part, kind of really is a grassroots thing, right? Whereas like you've got these kind of astroturf fake grassroots movement that are sponsored by like Richard Branson and Beyond Meat. Their biggest investor is Tyson Foods. The biggest investor in Memphis Meats is also Tyson Foods. You've got General Mills heavily invested in fake meat and the Beyond Burger. So I mean, you've got this kind of almost fake plant-based thing talking about sustainability. We're all gonna seeing kumbaya into the rainbow and hold hands with the unicorns, and we're all gonna eat grass together. It's gonna be beautiful. We're gonna evolve into these vegan ubermensch that in La La Land, and then you've got this other thing like low carb is kind of like diametrically opposed, where it's kind of people actually taking control of their own health and doing experiments on themselves. People self-experimenting for 9 years, nonetheless, like you. And that does give me hope for at least people turning away from the nonsense and the kind of what you said made you jaded before, and what I would say has made me extremely cynical about the whole system. I think you maybe used the word cynical as well. A lot of people think
I did.
it's like a pejorative. Oh, you're so cynical, but like, I mean, we got to be honest about the situation. It's like we've got to be realistic with ourselves. But that's a really good point. I mean, you've got well, just to finish my point there, the fake grassroots movement of like sustainable eating of vegetables versus like this whole foods unrefined paleo style approach, the whole low carb approach. I think it does give hope, but with all this crazy like attacks on carnivore diets and on low carb diets, I don't really know what it means. You got Time Magazine putting out pro high carbohydrate diet articles, and you've got a lot of clickbait stuff going on. So sometimes it's hard to tell what way the wind's really blowing.
It is.
Yeah, I have no idea what the hell's going to happen.
The plant-based stuff, sometimes it's really hard for me to tell, not only, well, I can tell which way the wind's blowing, but I can't tell how hard it's blowing, because it seems like a lot of the blowing is coming from a lot of
you got a lot of blowhards.
Blowers. Exactly.
Yeah. No, it's like it's crazy because with the internet, it's still consolidated. The media is still consolidated, even though you're on the internet. It's like, who's advertising before this video? People tell me all the time you're getting General Mills ads before and after my videos. So it's like, I don't know. I don't know how hard it's blowing or where it's gonna go.
There are the vegan movement is really interesting because it seems to be driven a lot by a concern that's not dietary at all, but rather ethical / religious, where I'll get attacked on Twitter, and attacked I think is the right word, because people will come on and start, they'll come to me with these preformed memes. Like, if I hear again, we're not carnivores because you don't have teeth and claws, I've refuted that so many times.
Good thing I was born with this Green Star juicer attached to my hip.
Well, my stock answer to that is, hello, we evolved a brain. Just because we came up with tools and strategies instead of doing it physically doesn't mean that we can't actually get meat. We obviously get meat. So the argument that we can't hunt meat is what do you call this thing that we're doing?
Yeah, well, look at hyenas. Hyenas don't make the kill, but they eat. Are they not? They're fake carnivores. Hyenas are not real carnivores because they don't make the kill themselves. They eat the scraps that the lions leave them. I mean, there's so many silly arguments. But it's funny that you would get attacked. I mean, you're such a kind person. like me, I'm kind of abrasive to people. I'll poke fun at the vegan movement and stuff, but like, I can't imagine them being so aggressive with you. It must be kind of shocking to see.
I don't know. Sometimes I've had my moments of getting set off, but I do try to be nice and I do try to be empathetic to people. But what I see from them is not really an understanding of science, but an actual kind of their actual motivation is a philosophical viewpoint about killing and death that I think is a fantasy la la land about how the cycle of life works, and then the nutritional components about it are secondary, that they don't actually read the science, but they are subscribed to this vegan lifestyle that comes along with canned messages about the healthfulness that they just buy without really reading into. And I find that very frustrating because we're just not even talking about the same things. So there's the plant-based world. There's that side of it, but then there's the conventional nutrition where diet isn't even really taken very seriously as a medical therapy, And I think that's in part to do with the fact that every other dietary intervention is based on this um, idea about nutrient deficiencies. Nutrient deficiencies were really hot about 100 or 200 years ago, where we started figuring out um, that you could actually find the cause of a disease turning out to be some specific nutrient that they weren't getting, and it was really hot, and that's where all these RDAs started being developed, because we realized, oh, if you don't get enough um, vitamin D, you're going to get rickets, and so this was really exciting to find all these components. And so a lot of the approach to diet has been modeled after that by saying, let's make sure you're not getting let's make sure that you're getting enough of all the things that you need. But when you look at a ketogenic diet, the mechanism behind the therapeutic value of a ketogenic diet has nothing to do with micronutrients and everything to do with mitochondrial respiration. And so it's not a matter of whether or not you got a certain component in your diet, it's whether or not your cells are running off ketones and fat. And so I think that people in the nutritional community still really haven't gotten that idea into their minds yet about what a ketogenic diet really is. And so they don't understand the power of it because they're talking about something that is really a lot less powerful and a lot more linear than this effect where if you have for a given person, if you have 20 grams of carbohydrate a day, you're ketogenic, but if you have 50, you're not. And so you can't just say, I'm eating less carbs and have it mean anything.
All right. Well, Amber, I really appreciate you coming on. I know that you've got a busy life. You got two kids, right? Or you have more than two? How many kids
I
you
have
got?
three.
Three
Three.
kids. Wow. And they were
Yeah.
all born after your all meat diet. Or no, two of them were.
One was. One
One.
was.
Okay.
All after low carb, though.
Well, which one's the
They're all
best?
brought up low carb.
Which one's the best? No, I'm kidding. Did you notice? I
There's a
mean, just
confession you won't get.
did you notice that? Did your kid who was born after the low carb diet, did they have any difference in development and health, autoimmune type stuff? I mean, autoimmune conditions are huge these days. I mean, just as a personal anecdote, we noticed that our daughter, who was born after we were on a vegan diet, she was conceived when we were just coming out of a vegan diet. She had dental caries, really bad. Our son didn't have any dental caries at all. Did you notice anything like that with with your kids and low carb?
There are some things that are different about them that are just obviously purely genetic.
Yeah.
But one thing that was really striking to me was that my third child, who I did wean onto an almost completely carnivorous diet, who had almost no vegetables for the first 5 or 6 years of his life, was never sick. He went to preschool, different preschools from age 2 on, and the teachers would often say, like, every other child is out multiple times a year and your child has never been sick. And so that was really striking to me. He's been very robust in that way.
And your kids eat a mostly carnivorous style diet now, or do you? I'd love to talk about family a bit before we wrap up, just because that's kind of one of the major themes here. I always call the streams the Eat Meat Make Family streams, and I got the Eat Meat Make Family shirt on, so we're real big into
Oh,
family.
yeah.
So yeah, so what do you feed your kids? What's your theory on that?
At home, they eat low carb. We do some vegetable dishes because they like that. And they frankly get bored with my diet. And I think that's because they've never had the palate rest that I've had. The youngest one was the one that had the longest carnivorous diet, and he was really happy with that. But the two older ones are teenagers now, and they simply got to a point in their lives where they weren't willing to miss out on the social parts of their school lives and their friend lives to eat that way on their own. And so I'm not going to force them. I couldn't force them even if I wanted to, because then it's going to come to like deceit or something, right? So we're upfront with each other. I feed them what I think is healthy at home, and I know that they don't necessarily always follow it, But what I think that the value has been is that they have learned to observe their body responses, and they've learned to question, because they've all gone through health classes at school where they're being taught something that's very different from what they're being taught at home. And regardless of what conclusions they come to, I think at the very least they're going to come to a point where they know that there isn't the consensus that they're led to believe there is, and that they have to learn to look at the science and evaluate it for themselves. So I hope that above and beyond what they're actually eating now, that they've learned that there are more options, and they've learned how to think about this.
There you go. Letting your kids think for themselves. What a crazy thought. What a crazy thought. Yeah, no, it's crazy because it's like you try to teach your kids one thing, and then what are the schools going to teach them, or what are their friends at school going to teach them? That's always an interesting thing. I mean, have you noticed nutritional dogma being taught to kids in school? I mean, you do see a lot of. There was an article recently that someone sent me about it was a preschool, but this preschool, unbeknownst to the parents, changed their entire menu to a vegan menu because one of the kids, who was the daughter of the teacher, the son of the teacher or something, was, I don't know, something, there was some nepotism going on where one of the administrators' kids wanted to be vegan, so they made all the kids go vegan on their lunches, and a lot of the parents were outraged. Have you noticed any of these things that maybe push up against what you've been teaching your kids at home?
Yes, well, there's definitely, I mean, there's explicit teaching in the health classes at the older grades about the status quo pyramid type my plate, whatever it is now, eating, that fat is bad, that there's meatless Mondays in the cafeteria, there's all these pressures, and it's all put forward as just settled science. That's the part that really bothers me about it, actually.
Meatless Mondays, that's becoming a big thing in the corporate world too. A lot of these Silicon Valley companies. I think Google started a Meatless Monday. I could be wrong about that, but yeah, a lot of the Silicon Valley tech companies are really big on the vegan push now, and you're seeing this in other corporations as well. So yeah, that's definitely something that's really alarming, and I would say definitely part of a bigger cultural zeitgeist that's funded through big industry and through companies like Cargill, Monsanto. I mean, Cargill runs 50% of the international grain market now, and they're heavily involved in the plant-based protein powders and pushing these plant-based options and investing in fake meat and all that stuff. So I think there's definitely something that people need to consider. And yeah, if your kids are getting meatless Mondays at school, remember that little thing called the Parent-Teacher Association. I mean, you do have a right to push back against the nonsense that gets pushed in schools, because sometimes you'd be surprised at the things your kids are being taught in schools, and you got to pick your battles. But I mean, some of this stuff this can be pretty detrimental long term, and yeah. So cool. So all right. So the kids are at home eating good foods, eating whatever they're gonna do outside of the house. I guess you said you had teenagers, right? Teenagers.
Yep.
Shit.
Two of them.
I'm so sorry.
I thought toddler years were hard.
Well, now, yeah, that's crazy. My daughter's.
They're good people, though.
Yeah, right. No, I'm kidding. My she's 6 years old, and she's going on 16. I swear, she's already got such a great sassiness to her. And I remember what a pain in the ass I was when I was in high school. When I was in high school, none of my food was eaten at home. It was like I was eating out all the time. I worked at a pizza place, and so yeah, that was. Oh, just imagining if my parents tried to feed me healthy, what it would have been like. It wasn't even in our vocabulary back then. Well, Amber, I really want to thank you so much for coming on. I think it's really awesome that you're out there advocating the way that you are. I think it's great. You have a background in engineering, right?
I started studying math when I first went to school, and I ultimately came out with a computer science degree and computational linguistics as a master's, and I've done some programming and data science in my professional career. So yeah, kind of an engineering, sciencey background.
It seems like some of my favorite thinkers in the space are coming from non-diet related backgrounds. I mean, just talked to Dave Feldman the other day. I know you and Dave are acquainted. Great guy, that Dave, and yeah, I mean, it just seems like some of the people that I love following are taking a slightly different approach to it. So yeah, I really want to thank you for coming on. Where can people find your work, Amber?
Well, I have two blogs, which is historical weirdness. I first started writing about ketogenic diets, and that blog is called ketotic.org. And then when I first decided I was going to write about carnivorous diets, I knew that I couldn't present the same kind of scientific rigor, and it was all more about my own exploration. So I put that on a separate blog called Empirica, where the .ca is at the end. So I have those two blogs. I can also be found on Twitter. My handle is Keto-Carnivore. And so those are the main ways that you can find what I've been working on. Well, yeah, it was a little bit of a cheeky note directed at Michael Pollan, but that's I feel it's more appropriate than his take on it.
Yeah, I love it. The eat meat, not too little, mostly fat. What was his saying? Eat plants, not too many.
Eat food, not too much, mostly plants.
Wow, it's just such a boring way of going about it, isn't it? Um, yeah,
Well, it seems contradictory to me. Food,
Yeah.
plants, yeah, okay.
Yeah, yeah. You know what? It's so funny the way I look at plants now. It's kind of like, well, I guess if I had to, kind of a thing. But thank you so much for joining. I really, really appreciate all your views and you're so kind to take time out of your day to come on. And yeah, you guys check out empiri.ca and ketotic.org. And then you can also follow Amber she's on Twitter. Yeah, a bunch of followers on Twitter. 15,000 followers on Twitter there. So you can follow her on Twitter, but be nice. Be nice. Don't attack.
No attacking.
Just be nice on Twitter, guys. Twitter's the bathroom wall of the internet, and everybody treats it as such. So, all right, Amber. Well, I'm gonna
Great pleasure to be here.
It was really nice having you on. All right, everybody. You guys can find more at primaledgehealth.com. It's been another little stream here at the Eat Meat Make Families show. You can find more at primaledgehealth.com. I'll see you guys next time. All right. Bye. They are